Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Eternal Philosophy to discuss the interwar period between the First and Second Punic Wars, where the pieces are laid for the greatest clash in antiquity, the Second Punic War. So we left off at the end of the First Punic War and the defeat at the Battle of Agates Islands. Now, when we look at the Barcid family and the sort of which is the main proponent of war with Rome, we first need to have a little bit of a backdrop to the sort of political landscape in Carthage. So at this time, the first real record of a Carthaginian government is Aristotle's account, which he argues is the best designed constitution in antiquity, which was largely speaking an aristocratic republic. And the aristocratic elements, which were also like a merchant class, so it's more like an oligarchy, were represented by Hanno the African, or Hanno the Great. And he had what we might call a peace policy with Rome, where he viewed consolidation of North Africa as Carthage's geostrategic interest and peaceful trade with Rome. That was and he represented the old guard of the aristocracy, the oligarchy. The Barcids seemed to be more of a new populist force. They seem to have the support of the people and the army, and there seems to be a more important voice for the people in Carthaginian Senate. Possibly that's the result of the fact that in many of these ancient city-states, the citizens were recruited into the navy. Oftentimes they were very poor, but you needed large amounts of manpower in order to crew ships. And as we saw in Athens, that led to a trend towards democracy. So there seems to be this democratic trend in Carthage, possibly related to the sacrifices made in the First Punic War, which the Barcids are trying to ride in order to gain influence. Now, Hamilcar Barca, who dies in 229 BC, is the father of Hannibal Barca and the beginning of the military genius that we see with the Barcid house. And then the question is, well, why do we see this? Because if we look at the Greco-Punic Wars, which we discussed in earlier episodes, while Carthage gave as good as it got against the Greeks, and according to Polybius, was poised to conquer Syracuse in the beginning of the First Punic War, they were not necessarily known for military genius. They were no Alexander the Great. There were no, Spartan commanders like Lysander or, Leonidas or anything like that. They were competent, but not, outstanding. But all of a sudden, with Hamilcar Barca, we get like a military genius, and then a whole line of military geniuses fighting as his sons. So what in part explains this? Obviously, native talent. Hamilcar and his sons had native talent. But presumably earlier Carthaginian generals had native talent, but they didn't represent it in this particular way. And I think what was missing was an education. The art of war is an education. And what tends to happen over time is it takes, especially in antiquity, centuries of experience before lessons are crystallized into forms and rules. And, Carthage had been fighting the Greeks at this point for 200 years now. And now they're fighting the Romans. So on the one hand, there's this accumulated tradition of Carthaginian military history and military tactics that's developed over the centuries. But I think actually the key to the education of Hamilcar is the Spartan commander Xenothippus. We read in The Roman Way of War by Vegetius that the Lacedaemonians made war their chief study. They are affirmed to be the first who reasoned on the events of battles and committed their observations thereon to writing with such success as to reduce the military art, before considered as totally dependent on courage or fortune, to certain rules and fixed principles. Now we see that in his account of the Battle of Tunis, Polybius demonstrates that Xenothippus did impose rules and principles to the art of war. To the Carthaginians. Now, one reason why I think that Hamilcar was inspired by Xenothippus was if you read the accounts of his battles against the mercenaries in North Africa, he seems to be fighting according to the same playbook that was used at Tunis. So I think it's not too great of a stretch to assume that he fought at Tunis was a junior commander and possibly even protege of Xenothippus. Furthermore, his Hamilcar means servant of Melkart, and the Canaanite god Melkart was identified with Hercules, and Hercules was one of the patron deities of Sparta. Spartans believed they were descendant from the sons of Hercules. So it's not as fresh to argue that they viewed themselves in some sense as co-religionists. And so having this sort of like religious interest to sort of like get, underlie their collaboration and their working together, he learns the art of war from Xenothippus. So I think what we can say is that the Barcids are a aristocratic house that are capitalizing on the new democratic tendencies in Carthage to gain more political power and unseat the aristocrats, pursuing an expansionist policy hostile to Rome, which begins with the conquest of Spain, and possibly a student of the art of war from the Spartans. So just setting up the Barcids and the backdrop for Carthaginian politics, what are your thoughts, Terminal Philosophy?
Right. Well, there's a lot going on here. Just in terms of background, I completely agree with you. The Barcas were an aristocratic family. There's not much detailed information about the family before the First Punic War. In my readings for this episode, there seems to be some sort of general agreement that the Barcas were likely a kind of landed aristocratic family. This pattern in antiquity, where you have commanders that are raised in mostly wealthy or royal families, is fairly self-evident here in the case of Hamilcar. I think it was, obviously this was true for the Greeks and the Romans, and it's also true for the Carthaginians. As you're sort of alluding to in your intro, Punic politics were largely, well, of course, there's the famous observation by Aristotle, but in terms of the specific politics within the Senate of Carthage, Punic politics were largely between the aristocratic class and what's been referred to as, I guess, the mercantile class. And Polybius mentions there's this sort of tension between the two parties being represented by Hanno and Hamilcar. Hamilcar, throughout the First Punic War and the mercenary wars afterwards, typically, although sometimes lost it, but typically had the support of the people, whereas Hanno had the support of more of the landed aristocrats. The mercantile class, interestingly enough, would often switch between seeking peace and war with Rome, because oftentimes pursuing peace with Rome often meant a retraction of their vast trading empire in the Mediterranean. But after, suffering some of these defeats, a lot of the mercantile class would change their mind and be outraged in the Senate that they're losing too many ships, and they're losing this, they're starting to decay their own trading empire. So, yeah, I think you're right that there is this general atmosphere of democratic power and democratic politics within Carthage. I also tend to agree too that Xenothippus was the one who ultimately ended up teaching, this more broad art of war to Carthage by way of, sustained wars. And I think it's just fair to say that the First Punic War was not one of these total victories on the part of Rome, as we covered in the earlier episode. There are various stages throughout the war where Rome suffered tough casualties, and especially at sea. And, one of the reasons why Rome did not achieve just a complete domination of Punic forces was in large part due to commanders like Hamilcar. And again, it's important to make a sharp contrast between Carthaginian art of war and the art of war that Alexander would have fought in the Far East in places like India. Again, you have sort of this, kind of co-religionist culture and highly organized society where, there's a rigid class structure, but it's not this top-down control of, say like a kingdom or an empire. All the citizens or subjects of these of Carthage at least had some sort of stake in society, whereas something like the Assyrians or like the ancient Punjabs, there was no opportunity for sort of social mobility. You were just a worm. You're kind of a subject. But at least the Carthaginians tend to represent. A fair comparison might be like the Carthaginians can be somewhat well compared with the Greeks in the earlier era between when fighting off the Persian invasions. So yeah, you have just a much higher quality. Again, you don't have these vast Soviet-style hordes, but you do have well-organized military and naval formations on the part of Carthage. So it's just important that to make that distinction between some of ancient Greece's and Romans, sort of more like lesser organized enemies, and Carthage, who I think we would probably agree on that was Rome's most formidable opponent. So yeah, without going into too many details about the sort of war between the campaigns in Africa and Spain of Hamilcar, I think that's a good opening intro for him.
All right. Now, when it comes to the causes of the mercenary war, or the truceless war, as it's sometimes called as well, when the Carthaginians surrendered to Rome in Sicily, Hamilcar refused to surrender and ceded command to Gisco. And Gisco then, basically took the humiliation of signing a treaty with the Romans, giving them Sicily, all of Carthaginian Sicily. Now, the initial plan was to send the mercenaries back one at a time, one ethnic contingent at a time, so they could be paid off individually. And then the remainder that couldn't get paid off wouldn't be able to then organize with the other mercenaries to cause any trouble, which Publius says was a sound strategy, except in North Africa, nobody followed through with that. Nobody started paying them one group at a time and only discussed payment when they all showed up. They were all really upset at that. Furthermore, they didn't hold their women and children or goods as hostages. They gave them back to the mercenaries, so they had no leverage over them. And at this time, they're trying to negotiate. But one of the problems that Polybius points out is that in order to control such a vast army, such diverse forces, the Carthaginians intentionally picked people from different ethnic groups, such that they couldn't communicate with each other, such that they could be easily controlled by the Carthaginians and they wouldn't plot to revolt against them. Normally that was an effective strategy, but these people felt so ill-used because they were promised huge rewards by Hamilcar in Sicily, financial rewards, if they continued to fight. And they weren't even going to get what they had agreed to before Hamilcar's promises. And so what Hanno is trying to negotiate with them, he's unable to effectively communicate, whether that's because the officers of each contingent intentionally mistranslated Hanno or honestly were misconfused. Either way, it led to a disaster. They camped at Tunes, which I'm pretty sure is where the same battle where Agathocles won against the Carthaginians about 60 years earlier. Now, the other problem here is that with the broader situation in North Africa, there were three pillars of Carthaginian power: the landed gentry who gained income from their farms and their lands, state expenses were paid for by tribute levied from the Libyans, and the military forces were drawn from mercenaries. Now, due to the prolonged war with Rome, which pressed Carthage to the limits, they basically exploited everybody to the limit, whether it was, taxation or conscription or whatever. And they were all at a boiling point. It was a critical mass for Carthage. A disaster was waiting to happen. Now, they didn't want to negotiate with Hamilcar because they felt that Hamilcar betrayed them. So Gisco was sent to negotiate with them. At this point, two villains arise, Spendius and Mathos, who are the commanders of the rebel force. One was a Libyan, Mathos, and then Spendium was a slave who had escaped from the Romans. And neither one of them really had anything to gain by a détente with Carthage. They would either be killed or sold back into slavery. And so they decided to push the angry mercenary bands to breaking point. And they were able to do so. And the way they did that, which is why it's now a truceless war, is they executed the Carthaginian ambassador sought to treat with them, which was in the ancient world, everybody understood that to be a, unforgivable offense and a casus belli for war. So basically, it was equivalent to Cortez burning his ships in Mexico. There's no turning back. We've crossed, the Rubicon. So at this point, Carthage's foundation of commercial trade and having a diverse, quote unquote, diverse, not our strength, army blew up in its face. And only by the continued misuse over the First Punic War were they all pitched into such a fever that they would overcome their ethnic and linguistic differences to fight the Carthaginians. So, terminal philosophy, what are your thoughts on the development and origin of this conflict?
Right. Well, by the time Hamilcar was brought into the war, the strategic situation was, a bit precarious for both Rome and Carthage. On the one hand, Rome had lost at sea, losing multiple fleets in several defeats, as well as some of these, a series of disastrous storms. And then on the other hand, I think importantly here is that Carthage only had 2 cities left in Western Sicily, where they only had the manpower to sort of maintain a stalemate. And this stalemate was largely presided over by Hamilcar, and even due to this manpower sort of material disadvantage, Hamilcar still ran a very successful campaign of guerrilla warfare against Rome, forcing them to use financial resources, and probably more than Rome should have. And this is a similar, more modern comparison might be how the Confederates forced the Union. It was, like a campaign of like sabotage and guerrilla warfare and things like that in the latter parts of the Civil War. And then after that, of course, as you were mentioning, Carthage was simply like financially broke and couldn't pay all these veterans of the First Punic War. And so that's what laid the groundwork for this mercenary war. And as you mentioned, Spendius and Matho were the the leaders of this mercenary war, and they had approximately like 70,000 African subjects of Carthage, and they ended up dividing their forces in several different segments. One to siege Utica and Hippo, and so it created problems for Carthage in multiple places. But essentially, this was kind of like, as you mentioned, kind of a critical mass for Carthage. There was not enough gold or silver to go around to pay all of these veterans. And I think they delayed for a little bit, but once Hanno, they basically begged the army veterans to bear with them and try and accept that Carthage simply couldn't pay them, and that's what created all these series of revolts. And that's where Hamilcar's basically, by this point too, I think it's important to mention that Hamilcar went back to civilian life after the second treaty, because the first treaty that was proposed to Rome was it was pretty harsh terms. Like the Carthaginians would completely evacuate Sicily. Carthage would not make war with Syracuse or its allies. Carthage would pay Rome 2,200 Euboean silver talents, or 56 tons, over a 20-year period, and the Carthaginian army would surrender their weapons and all Roman deserters immediately. So it was basically just like extremely harsh terms. But after that, of course, what you mentioned, the who had represented Rome in this treaty was killed. There was a new treaty that was proposed, and then Hamilcar kind of retracted back to private life. So, but he was recalled, now that we have this mercenary war with Spendius and Matho, he was recalled out of retirement. And that's basically what brought him into the mercenary war. And, you have basically, I was never able to sort of uncover a lot of the financial details, because at this point, Rome is just, starting to internally rip apart. But through whatever means, Carthage managed to raise an army, a new army of a lot of other foreign mercenaries who had not been, who were presumably fresh recruits, and they were brought into the conflict around Carthage and this Tunisian peninsula. And you had battles like Battle of the Bagradas River, and you also have the Battle of Hamilcar being trapped against the river with. I think it was after he had established communications with Utica, after he had crushed the rebel forces in between Utica and Carthage. But of course, this is where this second battle, this is where a Numidian chieftain named Naravus, who actually defected to Hamilcar, who had approximately like 2,000 horsemen and several thousand infantrymen, actually defected to Hamilcar, effectively freeing him out of a salient that he was pushed up against a river, and Spendius's forces had him basically trapped. But due to that defection, that kind of bailed out Hamilcar. So, I guess I don't want to go too far ahead in the mercenary wars, but that's my understanding of the sort of the groundwork that led up to it.
So Hanno was chosen to be the leader of the Carthaginian forces because Gisco was captured by the rebels. And the initial battle was successful in fighting the rebels. It was outside of Utica. He was trying to relieve the siege of Utica. But the problem was, while he effectively used his elephants and he brought siege weapons for the siege of Utica, he gravely underestimated the mercenary forces. These are veterans who fought under Hamilcar, crack troops, knowing many of the subtleties of the art of war, which he had presumably learned from Xanthippus, and only being familiar with fighting Numidian bandits after his initial defeat of them. He's like, oh, well, look, they're just going to run away and hide, right? So they flee to a hillock to escape the tusks and trunks of his elephants, who were just doing ferocious damage to them. And while he goes back to his camp to basically, celebrate, they launch a surprise attack and capture all of his siege weapons and supplies, which humiliates Hanno. And then there were 4 unnamed engagements near the city of Gorza that were described by Polybius, where he fails to take advantage of his positioning to defeat the rebels. And in frustration, he is sacked and Hamilcar is put in charge. Now, Hamilcar uses citizen levies, recruits new mercenaries, and has an army of 70 elephants. And throughout the narrative, Polybius emphasizes again and again and again how decisive the elephants were. In fact, the very presence of the elephants dictated that the mercenaries would keep to the mountains. Because, as we saw with the Battle of Tunis, and even before that, the battle with Regulus, where the Carthaginians were defeated, that the mountains were safe from elephant attacks and light cavalry raids. And so there's broadly speaking 3 engagements where Hamilcar fights these forces before he then decisively defeats them. The first one is crossing of the Bagradas River, where using a sort of low tide period, Hamilcar crosses at a point south of the river, such that he can cross it and then attack a stronghold on the river Bagradas that was garrisoned by 10,000 men of Spendius's army. And he defeats that force by crossing, and then it has a surprise attack, and which then gets Spendius to withdraw from Utica and attack him. And he's sort of in a hammer and anvil position, but Hamilcar is able to wheel his forces. So he's leading with his infantry, and his tail is his elephants and cavalry. And as he wheels his forces to meet Spendius, they're crushed underfoot by his elephants and cavalry, who are able to take advantage of the flat plains of the Bagradas. Mathos and Spendius are aided by a Gallic general, Atarius, and they seek to trap Hamilcar in a mountain pass with mountains on 3 sides. and they keep to the mountains. And this is where you mentioned a Numidian force comes up the rear, Navarus, completely surrounding Hamilcar. Hamilcar was in a tight strait, but it turns out that Navarus wanted to ally with Hamilcar, and using that to his advantage, he was able to push through at one of the blocking points, where through superior skill he overcame the tenacity of the mercenaries and broke out of the trap. And then we find the Battle of the Saw, where Hamilcar decisively defeats the rebels. But before we get to the Battle of the Saw, what goes on is a series of back and forth where the rebels keep to the mountains and Hamilcar keeps to the plains. Hamilcar's overall strategy is to pursue interdiction, almost a Fabian-style strategy, where you cut off their supplies and leave them vulnerable and undercut, so that they gradually starve to death, and you can defeat them in detail later. At this time, Rome and Syracuse dump in grain supplies and gold reserves to the Carthaginians. Syracuse wants to maintain its independence and so decides to keep the other great power in play, because if it's just Rome alone, there's no chance they'd ever be able to defeat Rome. And Rome doesn't want to see Carthage defeated for two reasons. They're too exhausted to exploit a war in Africa. And given that the rebels are seen as a kind of revolutionary force that would disrupt the aristocratic elite structure of landed aristocracy, which Rome itself had, and would set a bad precedent at home, they don't want to see them beat Carthage. So there's a combination of class interest and not wanting to risk another campaign in Africa, especially since they lost a large army under Regulus. Now, at the Battle of the Saw, what we see that's interesting here is Hamilcar gets the rebels into this sort of defile, where he corners Spendius. And what he does is when he attacks, he basically offers them a deal. It's like, look, you guys fought for me back in the past. If you just, surrender, don't fight Carthage anymore, you can join us. Spendius and the Gallic general are like, well, if that happens, we're both going to get hanged. So they sort of told the men to not accept Hamilcar's offer. And beginning with the whole start of this rebellion all the way till the end, they created this sort of mob mentality where they would stone to death anybody that contradicted the leaders. And so through intimidation and stoning, they kept any dissenting voice from taking a pro-Hamilcar, pro-Carthage position. Eventually, though, seeing the writing on the wall, they decided to negotiate with Hamilcar, who gave them very good terms for the rest of the army. But the rest of the army, not knowing what Spendius was doing and his inner core, thought that they were going over to Hamilcar and betraying them, so they rose up to fight. And Hamilcar, seeing that, sent in his elephants and his mercenaries and butchered like 50,000 rebels. So at this point, through a combination of supply interdiction, effective use of elephants, and massive financial and military support from Rome and Syracuse, Hamilcar was able to defeat one of the key rebel generals. And in the last engagement against Mathos, which again don't have a lot of accounts. He has a shared command with Hanno initially, but because they can't get along and their disagreements are so severe that it might lead to another defeat, the Carthaginian Senate says, well, you troops vote, and they vote for Hamilcar, and Hanno goes home. And then using this combined army with Navarus and his Numidian cavalry, he crushes the rebels once and for all. Mathos is captured, tortured, and executed. And what we see here is that the entire basis of Carthaginian power, basically large landed estates, exploiting Libyan African workers, and using diverse mercenary forces, finally blew up in their face. And only by the barest of margins did they survive. So, Terminal Philosophy, your thoughts on the rest of the mercenary war?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. In Polybius's accounts, You're absolutely right that he mentions the use of elephants in the Mercenary War repeatedly, and it's true for the Battle of the Bagradas River as well as the Battle of the Saw. And yeah, there was this this continued effort by Spendius and Mathos to convince his men that Carthage was never ultimately going to treat them fairly. They were just going to use them as pawns. They're never ultimately going to get paid. And of course, there's always this like harsh punishment of putting down any sort of voices of dissent or any speculation on the part of the mercenary forces if they started to feel sort of hesitant about the way the war was going between themselves and Carthage. And so what ends up happening is you have this horrible bloodbath of the Battle of the Saw, where basically the entire Spendius and all of his men, something like estimated around 50,000 by Polybius, were basically killed. And there's a lot of there's a lot of descriptions of elephants just basically trampling disorganized units of men. So yeah, pretty nasty. And then of course, yeah, the details as far as Mathos leading up to his capture and execution weren't very clear, but it was just further disintegration of organization on their part. And yes, as you mentioned, by this time, there was financial aid and different forms of aid coming from Syracuse and from Rome. And so that's where this ability to wage war basically came from. Yeah, really interesting. And, this mentioned, so this is basically effectively the end of the mercenary wars. But also at this point, which I think deserves some mention, is that I think, I can't remember which year, but the Carthaginian garrison on the island of Sardinia had rebelled and killed all the Carthaginian officers, and the main Carthaginian citadel in Sardinia had been taken over, and all of its inhabitants were executed and things like that. And so Sardinia, is not some sort of minor island. It's a fairly large island in the Mediterranean. And so they set out basically on a voyage and sort of a campaign to retake it. And that was first under the leadership of Hanno. But Hanno, whose men were sent there, they lost some of the officers, and then the rest of them also joined the mercenary forces there. And as a result, the mercenary forces were trying to convince Rome to take over Sardinia. But Rome was actually holding its part of the treaty pretty well. Actually, they didn't want to rock the boat with Carthage again, because there's some evidence to suggest that Rome, while they weren't broke, they were in sort of a military rebuilding phase. And so Rome essentially wasn't ready to go back to war with Carthage, and they denied this offer and sort of kind of bait really that was set up by the mercenaries to go in and basically shred the treaty between Rome and Carthage to take over Sardinia. So that's sort of the next chapter is in this mercenary war, at least that's outside of North Africa.
Now, at the end of the mercenary war, Carthage is broke, and it had survived one of the most severe threats to its existence. So now Carthage is at a crossroads. How do they rebuild? As I mentioned earlier, Hanno the Great wants to have an Africa First policy, where we have peace internationally with Rome, and then invade African territories and further consolidate their control there. The benefit to that strategy is, of course, you avoid direct conflict with Rome, who just defeated Carthage. You can then bide your time. Africa itself, especially in Tunisia and Algeria, was known for its fertile grain fields, so they could feed metropolitan cities and export that grain throughout the Mediterranean. But Hamilcar's strategy was an aggressive offensive strategy into Spain. Now, what we have in Spain is the modern-day city of Cadiz, the Phoenician city of Tartessos, which was dated to like the 9th century BC, facing the Atlantic Ocean. was the exit point for the silver trade from Spain to the broader Phoenician Empire under Tyre. So for centuries, it had been known that silver and rich mineral wealth was in Spain. And Hamilcar thought that this is what we can do. Spain was divided between warring Celtic tribes. Using his military prowess, he could build a power base in Spain fueled by the Spanish silver, where he could therefore get a de facto monopoly, and then build a power base for the Barcids in his future war against Rome. Fresh on the success of his campaigns in the Mercenary War, and also with the humiliating defeat of Hanno at the beginning of that war, the Carthaginian assembly voted in favor of Hamilcar's strategy. This is also at the point where, at the crossing of the Pillars of Hercules, Hannibal states that he swore an oath of eternal hatred to Rome in order to go with his father. Now, why did Hamilcar want to go to Spain? It seems that Hamilcar was trying to build an independent power base to become a sort of Hellenistic prince, like we saw in the Diadochi successors of Alexander. They minted their own coins, just usually what a king or an emperor does. They minted themselves on the coins. There's some dispute about that, but I think you can argue that they did mint coins with their own face on, like a king would. And having a monopoly on the silver meant that they got to determine how much the mother city got and how much they got to keep. So presumably the Barcids were trying to build a Punic monarchy rooted on a sort of populist support, a strategy that you'd later see with Julius Caesar, and then using Spain as their base of operations. Now, Polybius doesn't say a ton about Hamilcar in Spain. We have a little bit more from Diodorus Siculus. He basically states that he campaigned in Polybius states that he campaigned in Spain for 9 years, south of the Ebro, pacifying much of Spain. When the Romans sent an ambassador saying, "What are you doing over there?" Hamilcar is like, "Well, look, I'm just paying off the indemnity to Rome. Like, you should be happy I'm doing this." And apparently that was good enough. We have to keep in mind, as we'll get to in a later episode, Rome was busy fighting the Gauls and did not want to confront Carthage at that time. So they probably knew Hamilcar wasn't being completely honest, but it was one of those acts of brinksmanship that worked because Rome had other interests in mind. At the time of Hamilcar's death, Hasdrubal was in command of the fleet. Diodorus Siculus gives us slightly more details. He argues that one of the key elements of Hamilcar's campaign was meticulous planning and aggressive action. So if we assume similar tactics to the war against the mercenaries, we can easily imagine that Hamilcar would fight on the plains, utilizing a sort of hammer and anvil strategy. So on the one hand, you would have his cavalry, his Numidian cavalry, sort of outflanking and harrying the Gaelic formations, where the hammer would be his elephants just smashing into the Gaelic lines. And we know that the Celtic war bands were uniquely vulnerable to elephants, as we mentioned in our elephant video. When the Gauls invaded Asia Minor in 280 BC, they were defeated by Seleucus, who used his elephants to crush them. So he mentions that Hamilcar landed in Tartessus to fight the Tartessians. So he landed at Cadiz to fight the locals there. He defeated them. They had the king of the Celtiberian coalition in Datres had 50,000 men. We read vaguely that Hamilcar used some sort of stratagem to defeat them. Diodorus Siculus is unfortunately very vague in what that meant. Indantes fled to the hill to escape the elephants, just like we saw at the Battle of Tunis way back with Hanno, but much of his army had been destroyed. He then escapes and flees to another city, but he was then captured by Hamilcar and blinded and became a POW. He also recruited Gaelic forces into his army as well. And he then founded the city of Acaraluca, which is Alicante in Spain today, as a base of operations, which, fighting in and around that area, he died fighting a coalition of Celtiberians led by Orissi. And one of the reasons why he lost that battle was he sent his elephants and his mobile elements with Hasdrubal back to Alicante. So devoid of his ace in the hole, he was outnumbered and overwhelmed by the Celts and defeated. This led to Hamilcar becoming commander of Spain. He then used his army, marched back, and destroyed the rebellious general Orisi. So at this point, much of Iberia, south of the Ebro, has been pacified, and essentially two decisive engagements, one by Hamilcar against the Tartessians, and then one by Hasdrubal. And at this point, the Celtiberians are exhausted. And the way the Carthaginians kept power was mostly through a carrot and a stick. So the carrot was, we'll join our army and we'll recruit you, and then you can join us in our war against Rome and have imaginable riches. Otherwise, we'll burn your villages to the ground and capture your nobles and hold them as hostages. They definitely played hardball, and we'll see in the Second Punic War that the Romans exploited the resentment of the Celtiberians to get them to leave Carthaginian control. So what are your thoughts on the remainder of Hamilcar's life and career?
Right. Well, yeah, now we're on to the sort of campaigning in Spain, or sometimes known as Barcid Spain. And this Carthaginian expansion into Spain was motivated by multiple factors that you already touched on. And for one, more broadly speaking, is that Hamilcar in general wanted to take advantage of the fact that there was no sort of organized, widespread power within Spain. When if we ever had an accurate political map of Spain at the time, basically you have just a wide array of different tribes throughout Iberia, and there was no sort of, there was no one power that was that much greater than the other. The primary opponent that Hamilcar fought against was the Celtiberians. And of course, you mentioned that Hamilcar fought an army of like 50,000 strong under several chieftains. However, Hamilcar with several, there's several instances of, the use of hammer and anvil tactics and just better trained men, and also a broader coalition of, at this time, around paid mercenaries. So Hamilcar could sustain a prolonged campaign. Another reason why that he wanted to go into Spain is because he, at least Polybius speculates, that he wanted to sort of make up for a lot of the territorial losses in Sicily from the First Punic War, and he saw Spain as a good way to do that. And then third, I would argue, is that Hamilcar wanted to secure what was a well-known thing at the time of a silver supply, and these were gold and silver mines near the Sierra Morena. So those are sort of the broad campaign objectives, and he wanted to use it as somewhat of like a power base, like you said. I think like Alexander's Diadochi, I think that's a fair comparison, because at this point you do have silver coins with his face minted on them and things like that. So that was that was sort of the last primary campaign of Hamilcar, and that's basically the establishment of Barcid Spain. And at this point too, this is where we have a young Hannibal. And this is where he learned, and this is where he took part in some of these battles, even though he was quite young. Of course, he has these sort of famous oath against Rome. There's some speculation here as to whether or not this oath against Rome was out of defense or out of revenge. And so I have found that to be some sort of historical sort of a debate there between different historians. But yeah, I mean, I think you covered the battles fairly well. But yeah, I mean, honestly, the only, I think, formidable opponent that they had in Iberia at that time was the Celtiberians. And then you also have, at least towards the beginning of the campaign, you had, it wasn't the Massalia, but it was basically there was an ancient rivalry between the Punics and what was known as the Phocians, or I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, but basically back in 600 BC, Phocian Greeks had created sort of a rivalry that eventually kind of spilled over into a lot of different parts of Iberia. And the Phoenicians, or sorry, not the Phoenicians, but the Phocians were they were allied with Rome over the next several centuries, and that created sort of like trading favoritism towards Rome and not towards Carthage. And so for those first early years, meaning the 6th century BC, the Phoenicians, who were basically the ancestors of the Punics, they had set up several trading towns along the coast of southern Spain, but any expansion beyond that was pretty much made impossible due to this Greek and sort of like this soft Greek and Roman trade agreements. So that also was kind of an interesting background as to why there was already seeds that have been sown for war in that particular region. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, the last thing to end with here is Hasdrubal's charge over Spain. In 226 BC, because Rome is already engaged with war with the Gauls and does not want to fight Carthage at the same time, sends an ambassador to Hasdrubal to hammer out a treaty at which the Ebro River is the dividing line, north of which is considered Rome's sphere of influence, south of which is considered Carthage's sphere of influence. As a note, in avenging the defeat of Hamilcar, Hasdrubal raises a massive army of 50,000 foot, 6,000 horse, and 200 elephants, and seems to be a military commander at least on par with Hamilcar. And in defeating the Arissi, he takes 12 of their cities and marries one of their princesses in order to solidify his control of them as king, is what Diodorus says, which further supports the idea that the Barcids were building a monarchy in Spain. Furthermore, he, in probably the most important city founded by the Punic peoples after Carthage, was the city of New Carthage, modern-day Cartagena, which became the capital of their position in Spain. One argues that Alejante might have been the intended capital, but with the defeat of Hamilcar there, Hasdrubal presumably realized it was not as defensible, especially in light of the superior harbor at New Carthage. And he pursues more of a policy of diplomacy with the Celtiberians in order to cement his control. Presumably, he's bringing out the carrot now that he and Hamilcar had used the stick. Now, he's killed, according to Polybius, by Celtiberian motivated by a vendetta. And then by Diodorus Siculus, it said he was killed by one of his slaves. Now, this is one of the things that I really get annoyed with modern historians. They're going to say, well, look, see, you can't trust either one because they contradict each other. When in fact, there's no contradiction at all. If you were a Celtiberian who had been enslaved by Hasdrubal, I think you would have a vendetta against them. Possibly if you had been a prince of your own tribe. So there's no... If you have a court of law and people are reporting what they saw on a crime, they're not going to report the same thing necessarily because they're going to be paying attention to different factors. So what I would argue is that just like, reporting different factors, Polybius and Diodorus can easily be reconciled in a way that doesn't undermine the credibility of either. And so what we see with the death of Hamilcar, or Hasdrubal rather, in 221 BC, is that Barcid Spain is established as a power base on par with Carthage itself in Rome. And one of the problems we'll see throughout the Second Punic War is that, unlike Rome, Carthage doesn't have a unified political strategy. Because on the one hand, the Senate has the popular element, which supports the Barcids, because the Barcids still need support from Africa. They still need grain, they still need taxes, they still need mercenaries. But also, there's the aristocratic house of Hanno, which is the peace party. And so basically, they have their own control of Spain, but that isn't enough to fight a war with Rome alone. They still need African support, and that's the support that's not always as reliable because of the influence of Hanno and the aristocratic house. But at this point, this is the high water mark of Carthage. Hannibal is in charge of a massive army. I think he sieges Saguntum with like 90,000 foot, 10,000 horse, and 100 elephants. I mean, it's gargantuan. It's elite crack troops that are veterans of campaigns over the last 20 years. So we see here at the end of this interwar period and the solidification of Barcid power. The Hannibal is in the possession of almost everything that he needs: a power base, resources, silver, troops, and all he's waiting for is a pretext to go to war with Rome.
Right. I think that's an important distinction to make, is that Barcid Spain, I don't think should be thought of as just flat out as some sort of territorial gain made by Carthage, the empire, because this was definitely more of a Barcid royal family effort of creating sort of a new power base because of perceived weaknesses back home in Carthage. Of course, it's similar. Maybe this isn't the best comparison, but it's something like this. When you had sort of the disagreeing strategies between von Rundstedt and Rommel in 1944 in Normandy, you have also this conflicting strategies and general grand strategy disagreement between Hanno and Hamilcar. And so that manifests itself in this expansion into Spain. So, yes, by the time of Hamilcar's death, Hannibal is in charge of an incredibly massive army, and also presumably, these established supply chains and trade networks between, still at that time, between Rome and some of Rome's allies and some of the regional allies. And then also they're receiving supplies and material from Carthage itself, from the Straits of Gibraltar. So, similar to what Philip handed over to Alexander, so too did Hamilcar hand over incredible, massive territorial gains, a large army, money, siege equipment, and basically a newly established settlements that could be considered Barcid, exclusive to the Barcids, rather than just yet another Carthaginian city. So I guess I'll just say in closing that, this basically sets up the context for war with the yet another war with I forget the name of I can't remember which pirates there were, the Illyrians, I believe, and the Celts. And this that will come right before the Second Punic War. So I think I'll just leave it at that. And thanks again for having me.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast.